Hey everyone, Karnak here of Wars Armada Explained. Today I'm going to be doing another how to play video, and this video is going to be covering specifically attack range, arc, and distance, and covering line of sight, and obstruction, how does it play into all of that. This is going to be a pretty long video. I'm also going to be deep diving into some, rule stuff. So, this is going to cover as much aspects as I can understand from the rules, covering different niches and, rare case points. Because again, I want to make sure I'm covering everything, especially for newer players, so they are understanding the game. So this isn't going to be some like 5-minute video where it's like, this is how you do all this. This is going to go through everything. All right, let's get started. The first thing I want to establish is how do you measure range, arc, distance, and line of sight. I'm going to do a quick basic overview so you get the basic idea, and then we're going to jump into breaking that down into squadron to squadron, squadron to ship, ship to squadron, ship to ship, and squadrons and ships to stations, and stations to ships and squadrons. So 6 different points for all that. And I'm going to cover a specific nuance case about dust fields and interactions with that, and some other cases. Now, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be talking and using rules as written. If there is any point in the video where I specifically state that this is how I would make a ruling on something, I will make sure I'm stating that. Because again, just because I say something doesn't mean you have to agree with me, and you can, anyone can make their own ruling based on how they feel something is. But I'm going to make sure I'm at least giving evidence to support my stance and why I would, make a ruling like that based on how I feel something would play out. And like with anything, maybe FFG at some point will give us some clarifications. Maybe they won't. Who knows? Let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing I want to establish is how do you measure attack range and arcs and line of sight. Let's just break it down super simply. So every ship has 4 hull zones. Some ships may have more, some ships may have less, some ships may have different kinds, but for the most part, you've got front, left, right, and rear. Now, you can see that these green lines, that's what separates your hull zones from each other. That's where you know the front shooting front and left is shooting left, etc. You'll see here 3 different color bands. Black is close range, where you only throw black die. Blue is medium range, where you throw blue die. And red range is where you throw red die. Now at red range, you can only throw red die. Blue range, you can throw red and blue die. And black range is when you can throw red, blue, and black die. Obviously, there's other cards and upgrades in the game that can change things up and affect that, but we're just going with just simple basic stuff here. Okay, so in this example, we're going to say this Star Destroyer wants to shoot at that CR-90 Corvette. The first thing that you check is it in range? So in this case, Vassal, it's got this all popped out already, but you would take a range ruler and you would pop that down. Is it in range? Yes, it is at long range. It is not at medium range at all. Then the next thing you check is it in arc? So remember, if something is not in your arc, you can't shoot at it. But here we can clearly see it's directly ahead of the Star Destroyer. We know it's in range. We know it is in the front arc of the Star Destroyer. The third aspect that you check is now, do I have line of sight to the target that I want to attack? And let me go ahead and fade the Star Destroyer here. So you would check from your targeting point, which is the yellow dot in each of your hull zones. In this situation, we want to say we want to attack the rear of that CR-90. So you would draw from targeting point to targeting point, or yellow dot to yellow dot. Yes, I have line of sight to the defending hull zone that I want to shoot. Even though these other 3 hull zones are in arc and they're in range, it specifically states in the rules that if you cross over a defender's hull zone, in this situation here, I cannot see that hull zone. The defender's hull lines prevent me from shooting through the ship, essentially. Only on the defending ship. So as you can see here, that is an illegal shot. I can't make that shot. But if I was to shoot from front to the rear, that is legal. I can see that. All right? There's also nothing in the way, or what we call obstruction. Now, if there was like an obstacle or another ship that's between me and the target I wish to shoot, that would count as obstruction. You lose a die from obstruction. And it doesn't matter how many sources of obstruction there are, whether from, let's just say somehow this was supposed to happen. Even though you're shooting through 3 obstacles to reach your target, obstruction only counts once. You only ever remove 1 die with obstruction. Okay. So that is how we've determined range. That's how we've determined arc. We've traced line of sight. Let's talk about some other nuances when making attack ranges and things like that. Or actually, you know what? I'll save that for the ship-to-ship part. Let's move on to squadrons. Let's talk about squadrons of squadrons. Try to turn all these range bands off. So we've determined again how to do check range, check line of sight, etc. Let's talk about squadrons. I'm gonna pop all these guys out here. You'll see I have lots of stuff down. It's, like I said, long video. We'll get into it. So squadrons, in almost all situations, when they want to attack anything, they need to be at distance 1. If we bring the range band here, you'll see the black circle is distance 1. For example, if this X-Wing wants to attack Saber Squadron, he needs to be at distance 1 of that squadron. And if you see here, if you take the distance tool and you range it from there to there, you'll see that that is at distance 1. All right, let's go into some things here. Hold on, I want to actually move that real quick down to the relevant point. Now let's just put it, you know what, we'll leave it there. That's still fine. So let's go squadrons to squadrons. How to determine attack range and draw a line of sight. Range. To measure range, attack range to or from a squadron, measure to or from the closest point of the squadron's base. When measuring, do ignore the squadron's activation slider. So these blue tabs, or the blue or orange, depending on what you're playing with, they don't count for anything. For example, something like this. Whoops. So even though that blue tab is in range, the squadron itself is not in range. That doesn't count. You actually physically need to be hitting the squadron's base. So that's how you check range. You check range from closest point to closest point. Yes, we're in range. Now, how do you draw a line of sight to determine if an attack is obstructed or possible, or etc.? When to resolve an attack, players measure line of sight between ships and squadrons in the play area to determine if attack is possible and whether it is obstructed. When tracing line of sight to or from a squadron, trace the line using the point of the squadron's base that is closest to the opposing squadron. Squadrons do not block or obstruct line of sight. Meaning if there's another squadron in between these 2 squadrons and this X-Wing wanted to shoot Saber Squadron, that squadron does not block or obstruct Saber. So now let's measure what it's talking about for line of sight. Essentially, the closest point of 2 circles is always a straight line from center to center. That's how you would draw line of sight from squadron to squadron, from center to center. For attacking at distance 1, and we're going to talk about distance 2 of snipe. We're going to cover that in a second. Let's talk about what counts for obstruction. So an attack is obstructed if line of sight is traced through an obstacle token or another ship that is not the defender. Attacks that draw line of sight through an obstacle token are obstructed. And this is the most important thing, and I'm going to be saying this multiple times throughout this entire video because this is the part that most people forget or don't understand. If line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed even if the bases of the attacker and defender are touching. What does that mean? So this asteroid, for example, this is simple enough to understand. If I'm drawing line of sight through an asteroid field to shoot Saber, that attack is obstructed. It also means that they're not engaged, which, for squadrons and all that, that's a whole different video. We're not going to go into that. So that attack is obstructed. That X-Wing would lose 1 blue die in its anti-squadron attack. But Karnak, what happens if these 2 ships are so perfectly touching on the asteroid field that when you draw a line of sight over the squadrons, you can't see the asteroid field at all? It's like it's not even there. Well, again, rule is written: if line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed, even if the bases are touching. That's rule is written. It doesn't matter if you can't see the obstacle, even if they're touching, they're obstructed. It also still means they're not engaged. A lot of players and TOs will rule this wrong, where they'll have like something fly up to their squadron and they'll touch bases and say, "Oh, look, I can't see the obstacle anymore. That squadron's engaged now. You can't move that squadron," or etc. That's wrong, completely wrong. So there's that part of the ruling. Let's talk about distance one. If line of sight between two squadrons is obstructed, those squadrons are not engaged. Even if at distance one of each other, they can still attack one another. Question: if a squadron is at distance one of two enemy squadrons, one that is engaged with and one that is not engaged with, because it's separated by an obstacle, does the original squadron have to attack the engaged squadron? No, a squadron can attack another squadron at distance one, regardless of whether it's technically engaged with that squadron. What does it mean by that example? Let's look at this. So this TIE fighter, for example, say it's right there and this X-Wing is right here. So even though Saber Squadron is technically at distance one of the X-Wing and the Z95, there's an obstacle in the way. And even though that escort, or the X-Wing has escort, which what does that read as? Escort. Squadrons you are engaged with cannot attack squadrons that lack escort unless performing a counterattack. So again, in this example, even though technically both of these squadrons are at distance one of Saber, an escort typically demands that if you're engaged with escort, you have to shoot escort. Again, obstacle in the way, you're not engaged. That TIE fighter or Saber Squadron can shoot that Z95 if he wants to. He can still shoot the X-Wing. It's obstructed. He would lose a die. But he can shoot the Z95 if he wants to. Now let's talk about snipe. Distance 2 of snipe. If a squadron with snipe is engaged and another squadron is at distance 2, can it attack the squadron at distance 2? Yes. However, if the squadron of snipe is engaged with a squadron with escort, it cannot attack another squadron that lacks escort. Meaning that if the X-Wing and the Z95 are both at distance 2, even though the X-Wing has escort, he can shoot any target he wants. Even if this Z95 was at distance 1 of Saber and engaging Saber, Saber can still shoot or snipe any target that it wants. Now, if we reverse the situation and the X-Wing is at distance 1 and the Z95 is at distance 2, Saber Squadron can only shoot the squadron with escort. Now, if there was another squadron with escort at distance 2, he can choose to snipe at the squadron at distance 2 that has escort. He doesn't have to shoot the one that's closest to him. That's rule as written. It lays it all out right there. Perfect. Let's see here. Anything else for squadrons? I don't think so. Let's talk about determining squadron to ship attacks. And I want to read this real quick about shield dials. This is going to come up over and over again too. What do shield dials count and do not count towards? Shield dials, rule as written, stated specifically throughout, states that shield dials count as overlapping obstacles, squadrons, or other ships. So to give this example, the shield dials are the part that sticks out and the plastic framing for the shield dial, not the physical plastic base itself, just the little plastic bits that stick out and the shield frame. So that counts for when you overlap an obstacle, like something like this, that's overlapping the asteroid field there, that counts as overlapping. Something like this, where the shield dial just barely overlaps the squadron, that counts as overlapping. Even though in most situations squadrons can fit underneath the shield dials, that's technically not allowed. It counts as overlapping. You can't put squadrons underneath shield dials, or if your ship overlaps a squadron with a shield dial, it counts as overlapping. You replace that squadron. And even in a situation like this, if this CR-90 was right there and the Star Destroyer flew up and their shield dials touch, that counts as a ram and the Star Destroyer would need to drop back. Even in most situations, those shield dials actually can't like fit on top of each other. Again, it still counts as overlapping. That's a ram. Star Destroyer would fall back a speed, or yeah, would just fall back to the next available positioning on his maneuver. Okay. What do they not count towards? They don't count towards being outside the play area or off the map. They also do not count when measuring firing arc, range, or distance. Meaning that, again, as I mentioned before, that when you're trying to make an attack, you know, even though, for example, the shield dial is at close range, the ship is not considered at close range, it's at medium range. Okay, shield dial doesn't extend your measuring or your distance or anything like that. Essentially, it just pretends like it's not there. Same deal with off the play area, something like this, where the shield dial, you know, the ship is still on the play mat, but the shield dial is off. Doesn't count towards the ship being out of play. It's still in play. It doesn't explode, etc. Same thing with the deployment. Something like this is totally legal. The shield dial is extending out past the line because, again, doesn't count for anything. It's the physical plastic base of the ship itself that counts. All this stuff is important. Okay. Let's get back to squadrons of the ship. How do you determine range? We'll say that this X-Wing wants to attack this Star Destroyer. You measure attack range from a squadron, measure to or from the closest point of the squadron's base. To measure attack range to a ship, measure to the closest point of the defending hull zone. So this is where things get a little tricky. So in this situation, we'll say that this X-Wing wants to attack that Star Destroyer's left hull arc. As it says, to measure range, you measure from the closest point of the squadron's base to the closest point of the defending hull zone. Now, that does not necessarily mean that it's the closest point to the closest point, because the closest point of the squadron's base is over here, from this point to this point. That is actually where you check range from. I know it sounds counterintuitive, like that doesn't make any sense at all, but that's what it says, rules written. You measure to or from the closest point of the squadron's base to the hull zone that you're attacking. So you would measure, because this is the closest point, it's not from here, it's not, you know, it's measuring the closest point to the hull zone, so it's somewhere like right there. That's the closest point. You'll see that this is different than trying to measure from the center of the squadron. You see, that's two different points of interaction. But that's only when you're measuring range, not line of sight. So let's disregard these for right now. Try to get that off there. There we go. So again, when you're measuring range, closest point of the squadron. Then why does that matter? Because if you're doing something like this, even though this is technically sticking out further, the closest point to that hull zone is still somewhere like right here. That's the closest point, not here. Hopefully that is making sense and you guys are understanding that. Okay, so that's how you measure attack range. How do you measure line of sight? When resolving an attack, players measure line of sight between ships and squadrons in the play area to determine if the attack is possible and whether it's obstructed. When tracing line of sight from a squadron, trace the line using the point of the squadron's base that is closest to the hull zone. Trace the line using the yellow targeting point printed in that hull zone. Squadrons do not block or obstruct line of sight. So the correct way to draw this line of sight is not from the center of the squadron, but again, the point that is closest to the hull zone. Again, we've established that, you know, this is not the closest point here from the top, even though it like visibly seems like that should be closer. It's the closest point of the squadron to the defending hull zone. So someplace like right there. And a lot of people will measure, you know, just from the center of the squadron to there, but again, that does not signify the closest point of the base to the hull zone, because you're measuring, you see there how it sticks so far out left. The closest point to the hull zone is something like that. And that's even wrong. Let's see here, something, there we go. that is like the closest point. Again, this is where these are very niche and very, very nuanced things. It sounds crazy that that would make a difference, but sometimes it does form a difference. Why? Let's talk about obstacles. What happens, so if there's an obstacle right here, for example, if you were to just draw from the center of that squadron to the center of what you want to shoot at, look at that. No obstruction, right? You'd be like, oh, it's not obstructed. I can make the attack. Except when you're drawing from the closest point, trace the line using the point of the squadron's base that's closest to the hull zone. Again, the closest point to that hull zone from here to here, guess what? That is obstructed. See there? It's going through that hull zone. Because this point is closest to the hull zone. Not up here, not over here to the far left. This is the closest point. Again, that doesn't seem like that should make a difference, but sometimes it does, and that's something you need to keep an eye out for. Because in this situation, if somebody puts something like that, you can be like, oh, hey, you're obstructed. You can't shoot me. All right. And again, when measuring firing arc range distance, so you ignore the squadron's activation slider and the ship's shield dials and plastic portions of the base that frame that shield dial. What counts as obstruction? An attack is obstructed if line of sight is traced to an obstacle token or another ship that is not the defender. Another ship, if somehow another ship was fit in between there, if you trace line of sight over it, the ship or the obstacle, again, that's obstruction. Attacks that draw a line of sight through an obstacle token are obstructed. If line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed even if the bases of the attacker and defender are touching. Again, there's that point again. So in this example here, even though if this X-Wing had flown up and he was touching right on the physical base of the ship and is able to draw a line of sight, and even though you physically cannot see the obstacle underneath it, it is still obstructed. Okay, that's still an obstructed attack. Even something, for example, like this. If the obstacle is like this, and you fly up, and even if you're touching the shield dial, in some cases, like I mentioned, the squadrons can fit underneath the shield dials. Even if you draw a line of sight to the target, it's still obstructed. And actually, in this case, the closest point of the hull zone to the squadron is right here. That's where you trace line of sight from. Again, still obstructed. Even if you move that X-Wing to do something like this to where you shifted it, or actually in this situation here, you see there, now you're free from line of sight. Because again, you're measuring from the closest point of the squadron to the hull zone. So in this situation, you can see this squadron has now gotten around that obstruction because he put the closest point of his where you measure from to the hull zone right there. That's the closest point right there. Again, not from center to the targeting point, the closest point. Boom. Because that's the closest point to the hull zone. This is where all the nuances with squadrons happen, because a lot of people would just draw that and be like, oh, it's obstructed, because even though the bases are touching, blah, blah, blah. In this situation, this is a legal shot, and it's not obstructed. Perfect. But again, to do something like this, where this is the closest point to the closest point, that's obstructed. Even if they're touching, there's still an obstacle there, obstructed. Okay, I think I've iterated the point. All right. You guys kind of see like how this can get crazy. All right, now we're going to talk about a ship to a squadron attack. An attack originates from one hull zone, and the target must be inside the firing arc and at attack range. Or in the case of if you're doing ship to ship, from the cardboard, you're always, when you're measuring attack, it's from the cardboard of that hull zone. How do you determine range and line of sight? Range, to measure attack range from a ship. Measure to the closest point of the defending hull zone. To measure attack range to a squadron, you measure to or from the closest point of the squadron's base. Again, same thing as we talked about before. When you're measuring attack range, you're measuring from the closest point of the squadron's base to that hull zone. But again, you still have to be in arc for the ship. So even though technically that range from the closest point to the closest point, it's in range, it's out of your arc. The ship is not in arc to shoot that squadron. Even though the squadron theoretically probably could shoot your side cannot shoot back or cannot target that X-Wing. In this example here. Perfect. And why does that matter? Because, for example, like quad laser turrets, that's why you can choose any one of your hull zones to have your attack back with. That way you can avoid this example here where maybe the X-Wing can shoot your side, but then you can't shoot back. That's why in the FAQ it says that the quad laser turrets, you can pick a hull zone for that attack to originate from when you counter back. All right. Now, how do you draw a line of sight? So in this example, we'll say, you know what, this ship here, or the squadron here, he's at close range, he's in arc. And then how do you trace line of sight? When resolving an attack, players measure line of sight between ships and squadrons in the play area to determine whether or not it's obstructed. When tracing line of sight to a squadron, trace the line using the point of the squadron space that is closest to the hull zone. Trace the line using the yellow targeting point printed in that hull zone. Again, squadrons do not block or obstruct line of sight. What counts for obstruction? Attack is obstructed if line of sight is traced through an obstacle token or another ship that's not the defender. Attacks that draw line of sight through an obstacle token are obstructed. If line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed even if the bases of the attacker and defender are touching. So again, in a situation like, as mentioned before, if there's an obstacle like that, you know, even though he's in arc and in range, if we're touching like this, again, that's still obstruction. Even though you could probably draw, even if you could draw an example, like we'll say the squadron somehow could still fill that portion, even if they're touching, you know, there's still obstruction there. Okay. Let's get back to some crazy things that can happen with this. So, for example, if you were to draw line of sight using the targeting point to just the center of the squadron, you'll see there. You'll see that it's not. You're like, oh, I have no obstruction. I can roll 2 die. Again, you don't measure from center to center. Just like when the squadron's attacking the ship, you measure from the closest point to the hull zone. It's not center to center. Not in this situation, because again, you're measuring from so far left. You need to measure from this point to the closest point, which is like somewhere like right there. Yeah, something like that. And then you can see that that is obstructed. That's an obstructed shot. It's going through the obstacle. Does that make sense? Because if you measure from the yellow dot here, the dot to dot, that's obstructed. But you kind of have to go to where the closest point is, which is down over here. Because that's the closest part to the defending hull zone. So again, it's obstructed. You'd have to remove a die. I know this all seems, again, complicated, convoluted, but that is how it's written. This is all taken directly where it is written from the documents that they have in the rules reference guide. So again, that's how you have to determine when you're drawing line of sight and when you're checking ranges and things like that. So it's not always as simple as just drawing a line from dot to center with squadrons. You gotta have to take into account those slight changes and nuances in the rules. Okay. I think that covers all the squadron stuff that we need to go over. Let's go into ship-to-ship interactions now. Go ahead and delete these guys. Okay. Now, for ships, remember when you're doing an attack, you need to make sure you're in range, and you have line of sight, and it's an arc. Let's talk about when measuring firing arc, range, or distance, ignore squadrons, activation sliders, and ship shield dials and plastic portions of the base that frame the shield dial. We've covered that. To measure attack range from a ship to another ship, you measure from the closest point of the attacker's hull zone, and you measure to a ship the closest point of the defending hull zone. When measuring attack range for a ship, ignore any portion of the defender that is outside the attacking hull zone's firing arc, even if that portion is at closer range. Let me show an example of this. So this ISD-2, which throws the 4 red, 4 blue out the front, let's give an example. So this CR90, for example, let's do something like, see if I can get this just how I want it. A little bit more that way. And a bit, I need to get this example just perfect. You can see it just takes a while to do stuff, and make sure that this is the example that I'm looking for. Not quite close. Up a little bit more. Sorry guys, I know this just takes a while because again I want to give the example so you guys can see and understand it. What about that? Perfect. Okay. I'm gonna zoom in here. Oh, I can't zoom in too much more. Actually, maybe if I, there we go, and then can I zoom in? Perfect. All right. So what does it mean by when measuring attack range for a ship, ignore any portion of the defender that's outside the attacking hull zone's firing arc, even if that portion is at closer range? So for the arc itself, or rather for when making an attack, so we'll see here that the CR90, even though he's at medium range, you can see there that he's at medium range. I'm going to make a copy of the ship so you can see these lines better. Oh, you can still see just a little bit of that what I'm looking for. Perfect. So even though this ship is technically at medium range, you can see there, medium range, when you go to make your attack, if you measure from the targeting point to the targeting point of the CR90, you see that you've crossed over his defending hull line, meaning you cannot target the rear of that CR90. You can't shoot the rear. Even though he's at medium range, you're in range, and he's in arc, you don't have a clear line of sight. You're blocked by that CR90's hull zone. Meaning that you have to shoot now at the side of that CR90. And if we zoom in, you will see that that CR90 out the side is not at medium range. Ignore the fact that there still is like 8 pixel showing, but no, that CR90 is at long range. Meaning that when you go to throw your attack pool, the attack is considered at long range. It is not at medium range. So typically something like an evade token, where at long range it cancels a die, and at medium range it can only re-roll a die. So even though the ship is technically at medium range overall, when you're making the attack there, you're attacking that hull zone on the right hand side. It is only at long range. You're only throwing the 4 blue die, meaning that CR90 can use his evade to cancel 1 die. That attack is not being conducted at medium range, even though the ship itself is considered in medium range. Does that make, hopefully that makes sense. Again, that's in the rules reference. It mentions that. Same deal with again, when it's talking about arcs, even though, for example, we'll put it like this. There we go. So even though, right now I need to turn them a bit more. Try to get that example the way I want. I think that does it. Nope, a little bit more. Then we move him. that works. It's kind of hard to tell with all the black. Okay, there we go. So even though this CR-90, his base is technically at close range to the Star Destroyer out the side arc, the base is, again, when conducting your attack to shoot into the side of it, it's only at medium range. Again, the blue is the only thing touching that, not the black out the front. Even though he's at close range, technically from this point to that point, or from here to here, it's still, the attack itself is still only being conducted at medium range, not close range. Okay? Make sure I'm covering those points, because again, that's stuff that gets wrong all the time. Alright. I think we can move on to some other parts. So when resolving an attack, players measure line of sight. We're going to talk about line of sight now. And this is the one that's going to take a really long time. Between ships and squadrons in the play area, determine if an attack is possible and whether it's obstructed. When tracing line of sight to or from a hull zone, trace the line using the yellow targeting point printed in that hull zone. Again, squadrons do not block or obstruct line of sight. And you draw from yellow targeting point to yellow targeting point. You know, yellow to yellow here, or yellow to yellow there, yellow to yellow up. I crossed over the rebels' hull zone. I can't target it, so I can only target here and target there. And obviously, I can't shoot the left side. So that's the example for line of sight. What counts for obstruction? An attack is obstructive. Line of sight is traced through an obstacle token or another ship that is not the defender. Attacks that draw a line of sight through an obstacle token are obstructed. If line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed, even if the bases of the attacker and defender are touching. So again, to give that example again, so we'll say that this asteroid field, for example, is here. Even if the CR-90 and the Star Destroyer, even if their shield dials are touching on that obstacle, and if you could theoretically say, oh, I'm drawing line of sight, and I don't see any obstacle between the shield dials, again, stated rule is written, that is still an obstructed attack. It doesn't matter if you can't see the obstacle or not visibly, because it's considering that the shield dials are not playing a role in that, or if the bases are touching, because the assumption is that there's always some amount of minute space that is visible that you can make that attack from. Same deal, like, for example, even if that CR-90 was doing something like this, and again, we're not even counting shield dials, but you see there the bases are touching. If you draw that line of sight, you know, you could draw that line of sight from the front to the rear of the ship. That obstacle, you know, is still there. That obstacle didn't go away. It didn't go anywhere. So, for example, something like that. Even if these ships are touching like this, and you could physically put the ruler down, and it's on both the ships, or you use a laser pointer and you can't see the obstacle underneath it. Again, what does rules written say? If line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed, even if the bases are touching. So again, even though they're touching, even though you can't see the obstacle underneath it, it's still there. You're still technically drawing line of sight over it. It's still obstructed. Let's go into other Q&As we've gotten from the FAQ. While a ship is overlapping an obstacle, and the attacking hull zone's trace line of sight does not pass over a visible portion of that obstacle, or another obstacle or ship, is that attack obstructed? No. So what is that meaning? Meaning, in an example like this, we can get rid of this other Star Destroyer now. So it's completely covering that obstacle. You can't see that obstacle in any way, shape, or form. So when you do draw a line of sight, that is considered unobstructed. That attack is not obstructed in any way, shape, or form. Or something like this, to where even though your part of the obstacle is still sticking out right there, again, when you draw your line of sight, as long as you clear it, it's not obstructed. Again, to read it again, while a ship is overlapping an obstacle and the attacking hull zone's trace line of sight does not pass over a visible portion of that obstacle or another obstacle ship, is that attack obstructed? No, it's not obstructed. Again, but to go back, if line of sight is drawn over an obstacle, the attack is obstructed even if the bases are touching. So again, that still takes precedence, even if you visibly can't see it. Alright, while measuring line of sight, if a ship is in the way, do its shield dials and their plastic frames affect line of sight in any way? No. However, when determining line of sight, all other parts of the ship's plastic base can obstruct line of sight. So again, when you're measuring line of sight, if a ship, it doesn't matter if it's another ship, your ship, the other person's ship, do its shield dials and plastic frames affect line of sight in any way? No, meaning they don't affect line of sight, meaning they don't cause obstruction, they don't count for obstruction. So I'm going to go ahead and clone the CR90 to give you the example. So if you wanted to shoot this CR90 in the rear, and that CR90 right there is in the way, and you're not targeting him. I'll move the shield dial down over it. Here we go. So something like this. So even though line of sight is traced through this ship's shield dial, it does not block line of sight. Shield dials do not block line of sight. They're not meant to block line of sight. They're not supposed to be a per pseudo blockage. They're not, because they're only there for the purposes of counting shield dials, and when they do their physical movements, they're there. They still have to count for form of overlapping. They don't count or affect line of sight, and they don't cause obstruction. Now, if this line of sight, if this ship was like this, that's obviously obstructed. Then you would remove a die from that attack. But again, the shield dial itself does not cause obstruction. The shield dial itself does not cause obstruction in any way, shape, or form. Okay, I think I've covered for that. The final question: when measuring line of sight, do the attacker's hull zones block line of sight? No, meaning that if this Star Destroyer wanted to shoot the rear of this Corvette, it can do an attack like this. It can shoot through its own arc to shoot like sideways like that. Even though technically this targeting point is in the side arc zone, because the fact that that ship still has a piece in the front arc, it can shoot through its own arc to hit that target like that. That's legal. That's allowed. Its own hull zones don't block itself. All right. Let's talk about a nuanced example of obstruction. And we're going to get into a part where we're talking about me and I territory and how I would rule something. This question has come up a few times. Let's give this as an example. Say you wanted to shoot that CR90 Corvette. And let's put the Star Destroyer something like this. Now, based on this, you can see that obstacle is still, you can see it's sticking out from the left and the right of the shield dial, but it's not sticking out past the front of the shield dial. So if you were to draw a line of sight from the Star Destroyer to the Corvette, how would you rule that? Even though you visibly can't see the obstacle, would you say that that's obstructed or not? Because remember what it says: while a ship is overlapping an obstacle and the attacking hull zone's trace line of sight does not pass over a visible portion of that obstacle or another obstacle ship, is that attack obstructed? This says no. So again, if it's overlapping it, it doesn't obstruct an obstacle, right? But remember, shield dials, as it states the rule, they only count towards overlapping squadrons, ships, or obstacles. The only time that they are physically present is during an overlap. They don't come into play for line of sight. Because again, if these bases, for example, were touching, when you draw a line of sight, the obstacle is there, technically. And that attack would be obstructed. So why would that change if the ship was there and then now you draw a line of sight and then suddenly that is now unobstructed? How does that make any sense? If we wanted to use the ruling of the fact that a ship, to go back here, while measuring line of sight, if a ship is in the way, again, it doesn't specify whose ship, it could be your ship, it just says a ship, do its shield dials and plastic frames affect line of sight? No. So if that's no, that means that technically is not there. And when you measure your line of sight, that obstacle is there, that's obstructed. That is how I would rule this situation. That shot is an obstructed shot. You may disagree. Your TO or whoever else may agree with me, not agree with me. That's their prerogative. But until FFG points out something clearer, I'm using, based on the evidence and the answered questions that they have, that is how I rule it. Now, if this ship, the Star Destroyer, for example, was more forward and had its complete base over the entirety of the obstacle, that is unobstructed. That is an unobstructed shot. But again, if we place the Star Destroyer like so, again, that shield dial is right there. The obstacle is still there. If we're to discount the shield dial, and it's not supposed to affect line of sight, if we remove that shield dial, the obstacle's there. That's an obstructed shot. That's how I would rule it. Now, like with all things, that sometimes can be very difficult to determine. You just have to use your best judgment as a tournament judge, or as players. You have to come to an agreement on it. Sometimes that may resolve just doing a 50-50, either coin flip or rolling a blue die, and if it lands on hits, it's in. If it doesn't land on hits, it's out. Stuff like that. You have to make a determination or a ruling based on that. Now, again, there's no evidence to support if that is correct, but there's not that there's no evidence, rather there's no rule is written to support what I've said there, but there is also no rules written that doesn't support what I say. And again, I would I would say that there's more evidence that supports my ruling than supports the fact that there is no ruling for it. But again, all depends on what you guys on your tournament judge. Go by what your judge says. Let's move on to another part before I get into one obstacle that kind of throws a kink in everything. Let's talk about ships and squadrons attacking a station. So for stations in Corellian Conflict, we have armed stations and unarmed stations that were introduced. In standard play, unarmed stations are part of station assault. Let's read some things about them. Let's talk about, essentially, when you're making attacks to them. When tracing line of sight to or from a station, trace the line using the point of the token that is closest to the opposing squadron or hull zone. Attacks that draw a line of sight through a station are still obstructed. A station or squadron that is overlapping a station cannot declare an attack against that station. So, for example, if you wanted to attack this unarmed station, like in Station Assault, even though this point, you would draw to the closest point of the station. So that's the closest point of the whole zone, closest point of the station, so you would draw a line of sight to there. That's how you would draw a line of sight. You don't draw a line of sight to the center of the station. Again, closest points. That's the closest point, there and there. That's what it says there. Okay. And if your squadron or your ship is overlapping the station, even if it's just a shield dial, because again, as it states in rules, shield dials count for overlapping. This is overlapping the station. You can't shoot the station. Let's see here. Now, armed stations may attack and draw a line of sight to ships and squadrons overlapping. So even, for example, let's get the armed station over here. Even if your Star Destroyer is like covering the entirety of the station to where you can't see the station, excuse me, it can still attack and draw a line of sight to anything overlapping it. While the armed station is attacking, if the defender is a ship overlapping the armed station may attack and draw a line of sight to any of the defender's hull zones. The armed station cannot obstruct its own attacks. So even though you physically have no way to trace line of sight through a ship base to any of these points, it specifically states it doesn't matter. It can still draw a line of sight and attack any hull zone that it wants to if you've overlapped it. Even if it's something like this, guess what? It's overlapped. It can draw a line of sight to your rear hull zone and attack your rear hull zone, because that's what it states rule as written. But if you're overlapping it as the attacker, you can't shoot it. You have to move off of it and not be on it. Same thing with squadrons. Squadrons can't be on overlapping the stations at all, either for station assault or otherwise in the Corellian Conflict if using armed stations. Excuse me. All right. let's talk about something slightly controversial. And this is something that has come up before as well. And this is going to take something that, again, is going to take a little bit of talking. Let's talk about dust fields, again, introduced in Corellian conflict. What do dust fields do? A ship that traces line of sight across a dust field while attacking a ship or squadron cannot perform that attack, but may declare another target. If a squadron traces line of sight across a dust field while attacking, that attack is obstructed. So pretty much squadrons treat dust fields same as anything else. Actually, let me get the squadron out here to show an example of something. Get out a B-wing. So in this situation, let's say this ship wants to attack the squadron or the CR-90. Again, it's checking range. It's in range. It's checking an arc. They're both in front arc. But guess what? He goes to draw a line of sight. It traces over the dust field. As mentioned, a ship cannot perform an attack if line of sight traces over the dust field while attacking. It cannot perform that attack. It's a cannot. You can't do it. Same deal if your ship wants to attack that squadron. Can't do it. It traces over the dust field. Now, the squadron can still attack your Star Destroyer. An example, this B-wing, he throws a blue and black on anti-ship. He's just obstructed. He can remove one of his bomber die and still attack with his other one. He's fine to attack your ship. He can do that. That's totally legal. Because again, it's only obstruction for squadrons. For ships, ships can't attack at all through dust clouds. So, why do I bring that up? So in a game, somebody was clever, or trying to be clever, and they had a Gazanti. We're going to put that guy over there. We're going to move some stuff out of the way. And he managed to fly a Gazanti to where it covered the dust cloud. And he put his ship over it. And then his Star Destroyer went and was like, oh, my Star Destroyer can now shoot through to the CR-90. So, how do you make this ruling? And again, we're going to go into territory about how I would rule in this situation. What happened in that game was the TO said, oh yeah, you can't see the dust field, you can shoot through it. And obviously the other player was a little upset about that. So, was that legal? Is that something that is legal? And again, this all comes down to whatever your TO decides. You have to go by what they say. My ruling on this would be that that is not a legal shot. Because if it was anything else, again, it doesn't matter how many ships or any other obstacles in the way. There could be that many obstacles like that in the way. Again, obstruction only counts once. It doesn't matter how many times it passes through anything to get to that point. The only time it changes is with dust fields. Again, a ship that traces line of sight across a dust field while attacking a ship or squadron cannot perform that attack. Just because that Gazanti is overlapping that dust field to where you visibly can't see it, it is still technically there, and you are still technically tracing line of sight across it. Where do we get situations where you can make a ruling, or where I can make that kind of ruling? Let's talk about objective tokens. There's a question in the fact that says, can a card effector squadron with strategic move objective tokens to or from a position where they are overlapped by a ship? Yes. If necessary, that ship's owner may mark that ship's position and lift it out of the way, then return it after the token is moved. So, if this objective token, for example, for something like fire lanes or sensor net or what have you, just because you overlap that objective token with your ship, it doesn't mean that it's gone and that you can't do anything to figure out if it's there or not. Because remember, like for sensor net, if you wanted to claim that token, you need to be at distance 1. So in order to see if you could claim it with like another ship, even if it's being covered by a ship, you mark the position of the Star Destroyer, you move it out of the way, you say, yes, my ship is at distance 1 to claim that token, and then you pick up that token, like if it's sensor net, and then you put the Star Destroyer back. Okay, so just because it's covered doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The token is still there. By an extension of that logic, you can make the ruling that, again, just because this Gazanti is covering that obstacle, obstacles are still considered a token, it is still there. Again, when we go back to the armed station, even though ships and squadrons are overlapping it, it's still able to draw a line of sight to whatever it wants to attack, even though it's being covered and you can't physically see it anymore. It doesn't mean it ceased to exist. Same thing with Dustfield. If you draw a line of sight across Dustfield, it's still there, and it is still preventing your attack. That is how I would rule it. Okay, just because there's another ship in the way, and even though ships grant obstruction, again, the dust field specifically says if you trace line of sight across a dust field while attacking, you're still tracing line of sight across a dust field when you're attacking. It doesn't matter there's a ship there. And I think I've iterated that point a few times now. I think that, again, that's how I would rule it. You may disagree. Other judges may disagree. That's fine. That you judge tournaments however you want to judge. But that's how I would rule it. And hopefully, and we've asked this question of FFG to make a clarification, so hopefully some point in the future there will be a clarification about stuff like this. But until then, all we are human beings, and we have to make rulings based on what we have available to us. And again, based on my stance and viewing rulings and how things have been ruled otherwise, that's how I support my stance for making a judgment like that. So that is everything. I mean, I think that's everything that I can possibly cover. But of course, you probably will have questions. You might have some concerns. You may not agree with something. Please leave a comment. Allow me to either argue for or against, or if you have any more in-depth details or questions, be sure to point it out. Oh, one more thing. Dustfields and Jaina's Light with the CR90. So Jaina's Light, your attacks cannot be obstructed. But again, a dust field is not obstructing attacks. It is preventing any attack, period. So just so you know, Jaina's Light cannot shoot through a dust field. Cannot. It's a cannot, because again, you trace line of sight. If you perform an attack, it just says you can't do it. It doesn't say obstructed. It just says you can't attack. So Jaina's Light cannot shoot through a dust field. Of course, if you guys, again, questions, concerns, comments, if you think I'm wrong or got anything wrong, please be sure to point it out. Let me know. As always, I appreciate you guys watching my videos, and I'll catch you next time.